Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Marliese with Little Crocus Modern Heirlooms, where I make fiber and letter arts for today's world, but rooted in historical traditions. My big goal for the year is to build an Edwardian and late Victorian inspired wardrobe, but do it in such a way that the individual pieces can be mixed with my modern clothes for a history-bounding look. So the first piece as part of this series is going to be a fully smocked ladies bishop blouse. The bishop is a style that you would see in women's wear in the late 1880s, 1890s-ish, but you continue to see smocking in women's clothes all the way up into the 30s and even the 40s. It's definitely still alive today in children's wear, especially in the Southeast where I am. In order to make a bishop blouse, I first have to pleat the fabric. I had this whole plan to make a pretty straightforward video on how to use a mechanical pleater. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that ended up being a little bit more complicated than I thought. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna break this down into 3 steps. And the first video as part of this series is going to focus on how to prepare your fabric and how to prepare your tools for the actual pleating. If you're not familiar with smocking or the bishop style, this is a very simple example. This is a young girl's dress. And the bishop is basically, it's a raglan style top or dress where there's a large quantity of fabric that has been tightly gathered into the neckline. And then decorative stitches have been placed on top or underneath the pleats in order to hold them in place and to allow elasticity and movement, or not, depending on what the style requires. Now, even though I have put all of my librarian superpowers to work, I have not been able to find a historical source that explains why we call this a bishop. There's lots of theories, but nothing concrete. So if you actually know why we call this a bishop, please comment below because I would love to find that out. So this is my pleater. It is a little Amanda. The larger ones are called the Amanda Jane or the Super Amanda. But this is the little Amanda. It is 16 rows with half spaces. The wider a pleater gets, the more difficult it is to kind of control the fabric as it goes through. I was mostly doing children's outfits. I very, very rarely needed more than 16 rows. It is made up of these metal rods, and so this is a hold pin. And once you remove that, you can just pop this rod out. Well, the other one on the other side might be helpful. And there you go. So the rod just pops out, and then you can see the needles just set in here. So you can see here is the inside of my bishop top, my ladies bishop top. And so here's the arm curve. So you can see it'll be like this. So I want to know how far down can I go before I start getting into this arm curve. So kind of probably around here would be okay. If I line it up, that gives me an idea. The pattern says to do 16 rows, and so this kind of validates that. I can do 16 rows without getting into that curve. But of course, the larger or smaller size you are, you may have more width here and you'll want to adjust accordingly. You just want to make sure that you don't get down into this curve, okay? So I can do all 16 rows and feel fairly confident that that's not going to be a problem for me. These are special smocking needles. I do have to buy them from a local heirloom store or an online retailer. Most heirloom stores I know, even though they're local stores, they still will ship. But of course I like to support local businesses when I can. You do want to make sure that you know what brand pleater you have, like the Pullin pleater or the Dr. Joe's Pullin pleater. There's also the Reed pleaters is another brand, and then you have the Amanda Jane. So you'll just kind of want to know what brand you have to make sure that you have the needle that's going to best fit. Sometimes you'll get different shank lengths, and it's best if they're all the same. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're shopping for needles. These came from my local store, the Sewing Room in Birmingham, Alabama. I've also purchased before from Farmhouse Fabrics, which has fantastic customer service and a really great online store. So if you don't have an heirloom sewing store near you, which is the case often when you're not in the Southeast, where we smock everything that doesn't move fast enough, then you can try one of those online retailers like Farmhouse Fabrics, and you'll have no problem at all. So I'm only going to pleat full rows because I'm fairly confident in my smocking, and so I'm able to space things pretty well without having half space markers. If I were doing something very complex, or I maybe was new to smocking, I might want to put in some half row spacers just to be a visual cue as I'm doing my smocking. However, I am going to put in one extra half row right at the beginning. That's because this is going to be my neckline, and so to have an extra half row in here just holds things firm and keeps it from fraying out, and just helps keep the spacing correct. And so obviously, since this is going to be very close at the neck, you want it to be as accurate as possible. So I'm just gonna, it's very easy. From here, you just put your brass back in, your brass roller, and you replace your pins. That's another reason I like this particular pleater. It goes together very easily. It has these pins, so I don't need any screws or anything to put it together. And so now I can see here is how you roll it. So the next thing we need to do is roll our fabric onto a dowel or a rod. I use just a plain piece of PVC. I don't know if I bought this or I might have just stolen it from my dad's basement. Any kind of pole that's sturdy. You could use a wooden dowel. They sell rods specifically for pleating, so it's kind of whatever floats your boat or your budget. The thing here is that we are going to be rolling onto this. You want to keep your fabric as straight and regular as possible. So I have already ironed this. I'll iron it again before rolling. There's a slight curve here, and we're gonna, address that as we're rolling, but you really want to keep that kind of as straight as possible. And so I'm gonna go ahead and lay out my fabric, kind of folding over my arm curve, so that when I roll it up on my dowel, it will just roll very smoothly. You want to keep this as smooth and as even as possible. You might be okay just rolling it, kind of depends on you. If this is a wooden dowel, I might even put some flat pins in. I'm gonna go and grab some masking tape. You can use some painter's tape. I just wouldn't use anything that has a lot of residue, like duct tape would probably be too much. They do actually make these bars specifically for pleating that have like some kind of magnetic or something that tucks in to keep it firm. Maybe similar to what you'd see like in a quilter's rod, quilter frame, or like an embroidery frame. But I'm cheap and I'm not going to do that. I just want something that's going to hold this for a few wraps, because once I get a few times around, it's going to kind of hold itself. So I don't really need to overthink this part. This is really just a helpful guide, okay? And now I just want to roll it very carefully, keeping this upper line as smooth as possible. And so because this is a women's outfit, the gradient is not as extreme, as opposed to like a child's neckline curve is going to be steeper. This one's fairly gradual, fairly general. So that makes it a bit easier. But you do want to try to keep this as consistent as possible. And just as you approach a shift, you just kind of ease that excess curve in. or just kind of adjust it. Just little tugs. Nothing big, nothing that's going to distort the fabric. And you just kind of roll that extra arm curve fabric in. And it's okay, so here's the end of my pole and it's coming off. You just want this as smooth as possible. The smoother you make this, the more successful your pleats will be. Okay, so now let me lay out the rest of my fabric. And I try to have all of my arm curve sections laying the same direction. To me, it's easier to roll it away, but you know, you can, if you learned a different way, or if you find it's easier to fold it in first, you know, as long as this part is flat, it doesn't really make much difference which way you roll it. Okay, so now you can see we're starting to shift in, so you just want to kind of keep that in mind. Maybe tag a little bit up here, keep it smooth down here. You can do some adjusting while you're rolling it onto the pleater, but the more you can keep your adjustments here on the rod, the easier it will be when you're cranking it through the pleater. Because you're kind of multitasking, you're keeping a bunch of things in your head when you're rolling it onto the pleating needles. Okay. You can see there's not a whole lot of variance, because it is a lot of fabric, and so the curve is very gradual. And don't be afraid to unroll and re-roll as you need to, okay? And so you can see now we're kind of going back up to our gradient. I just want that as smooth as possible. I don't think I mentioned that I did do French seams on this particular blouse. If you have access to a serger, doing like a very small rolled hem can also work beautifully. Most of my children's dresses are done with a serged hem here. Just anything that's going to be not bulky. So you want it to kind of just slip into the groove of the pleat if possible. Roll that back so I can get this straightened out. And roll it on. And again, just you want that as smooth, as flat, and as even as possible, okay? Okay. So the point of putting it in a dowel is that then you can slip it in here, and then you roll the fabric in this way. So the dowel gives you some control, gives you some stiffness here as you're feeding the fabric in. All right, so now let's get our threads. Okay. And I'll just start threading as I go along so that I can keep track of what I'm doing. There we go. nice long tails. Long tails are your friend, because if your tails are too short and pull loose while you're pleating, then you have to start all over. If you're just one or two pleats loose, you can kind of fudge it using a needle, but it's more than a couple pleats, and you really just have to start over. Alternate colors. That gives me some visual cues as I'm doing my row spacing, as I'm doing my smocking. Just kind of nice indicator of where I am, but I'm not super exact. Sometimes if you get pre-pleated sections, they'll all have the same color. Sometimes you'll have a rainbow. I mean, this thread comes in all colors, so it really just kind of depends on your preference. One thing to keep in mind if you're pleating on light colored and lightweight fabric is how dye fast is your thread, and also its possibility of leaving little fibers behind that might leave colors. So that's another reason I like fairly kind of lightweight, neutral-ish colors. There's kind of an orange that's also really popular. It's frequently used. It's very easy to see, especially for those with visual limitations. You know, it's just kind of what's your preference. Why I like setting up my box. It provides some tension, some order to my threads. So now I've got all my threads straightened up. So if you found that helpful, please click the like button below, and I'd love to hear your comments about what was helpful, what you still have questions about. And of course, if you'd like to follow me through the rest of the series and find out how to actually smock this bishop and construct it, as well as all the other items I have in store for this year, please click the subscription button below.